Hey folks, I've frequently mentioned on my channel that I've been maining Protection Warrior for this past raid tier. While I've played it on and off for years, I decided to try it again early in Castle Nathria and I fell in love with the playstyle. Prot Warrior is extremely fun to play, and while it may not do a ton of damage thanks to tuning, the rotation feels extremely rewarding to execute correctly, pun intended. However, despite my love for this spec, it's become abundantly clear to me as I progress through Mythic Sanctum of Domination that there are some critical flaws limiting the viability of Prot Warrior. It's also not just me who thinks this. Take a look at these numbers from Warcraft logs, which compare the number of kills for each tank on mythic bosses in the last 2 weeks. Even on Terragru, the first boss in the raid, Prot Warrior has less than half the number of kills as Guardian Druid, which is the second least popular tank. As you go into the later bosses, it just gets worse, with Prot dropping below 1,000 kills on Remnant, below 500 kills on Soul Render, and by the time you reach Sylvanas, Prot Warrior has just 142 kills at the time of recording. Even Guardian Druid, which is surprisingly low, has almost double this amount. Clearly, there is something wrong with Protection Warrior, and in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what that problem is. In order to understand the fundamental problem that plagues Prot Warrior, we first need to discuss its damage performance. Now, contrary to what many tanks would have you believe, tank damage is actually fairly important. It's obviously not the most important aspect of a tank, but it does play a significant role in their viability. For instance, Protection Paladins are notoriously squishy and quite hard to play, but in the right hands, they can put out monstrous damage numbers. While every tank should be able to survive every raid boss, there's usually a degree of balance between the tank's tankiness and their damage potential. Prot Pallies trade a bit of their survivability for more damage, and tanks like Blood DK or Vengeance DH will do less damage overall but end up being pretty much unkillable. As the numbers on screen show, Prot Warrior ends up being one of, if not the lowest DPS tank on every single boss. There is a clear divide currently between Paladin, Monk, Druid, and DK DH Warrior. Like I mentioned before though, this trend is perfectly fine in theory. Prot Warriors may end up doing less damage than other tanks, but that's completely acceptable if they end up being an unkillable juggernaut. Unfortunately, that's not the case at all, and it could actually be argued that Protection Warrior is the weakest tank survivability-wise, or at least the second weakest, maybe just above Protection Paladin. Many people will probably hear this and be extremely surprised. Others will immediately jump to the comments section and tell me that I'm wrong, but hear me out, because the issue with Protection Warrior's survivability isn't that it's universally bad. Rather, it's extremely lopsided. When it comes to physical damage, Prot Warriors are one of, if not the best tanks at mitigation. Many people will remember back in Castle Nathria, where Prot Warrior was a fairly popular choice, and that was largely because of all of the challenging bosses, which had a high emphasis on physical damage, especially through their auto attacks. Shield Block is absurdly strong when it comes to reducing damage from stuff like this, and this makes Protection Warriors a fantastic choice for many bosses. Another area where warriors are good, but admittedly not exceptional compared to other tanks, is infrequent burst damage, both physical and magical. Shield Wall is a flat 40% damage reduction cooldown, which, while not especially interesting, is incredibly powerful. Spell Reflection is also an extremely potent magic DR cooldown, but it's only if it's a short burst of magic damage that can't be reflected. Now, speaking of Spell Reflection, it's time to talk about Prot Warrior's primary weakness, magic damage mitigation. This is an area that has always been a little bit murky for tanks, and it's generally less impactful than physical damage mitigation, but when a difficult fight requires it, magic damage mitigation can make or break your tanks. As mentioned previously, most of the heavy-hitting abilities in Castle Nathria were physical, and while some mechanics dealt magic damage, they were either tuned low enough or cast infrequently enough to where Spell Reflection or other major cooldowns were enough to handle it. While this was the case for most of Sanctum of Domination, it's unfortunately not the case for Sylvanas, which is the final and most challenging boss fight, especially when it comes to tank survivability. Sylvanas is interesting in that almost all of her attacks do an equal amount of physical and magic damage. This would be extremely difficult for Prot Warriors to handle on its own, but things get even more brutal when you reach Phase 3, which is notorious for shredding tanks. The Banshee's Bane dot dishes out an absurd amount of magic damage, and most tanks will either pop a defensive cooldown or just save their healing spells to counteract it. Protection Warriors are the only tank in the game to not have a reliable sustained magic damage mitigation or an actual form of self-healing. This means that you're heavily reliant on your healers to counteract your ticking damage, and if you get hit with a Veil of Darkness at the wrong time, you're as good as dead. Outside of burning one of your major cooldowns, which you'll generally want to have planned out for specific spots within Phase 3, the only tool that Protection Warriors have to counteract this damage is Ignore Pain, and that brings me to my final major point. I'll be blunt, I despise the current design of Ignore Pain, and I've actually butted heads with a few other prot warriors over this point. For reasons that I cannot understand, some people seem to believe that this button is an extremely powerful mitigation ability when I am genuinely convinced that it is terrible. I need to make something abundantly clear to every Protection Warrior main watching this. Ignore Pain is not a defensive cooldown. It's an absorption spell. I see a surprisingly large amount of people getting confused by this because they see the ignore 50% of damage taken part and automatically assume that Ignore Pain is somehow reducing their damage taken. This is not the case. Simply put, what Ignore Pain actually does is apply an absorption shield to you, and half of the damage you take is mitigated by that absorption shield. This means that Ignore Pain isn't even a true absorption spell like Power Word Shield, and going by the numbers, it only shields me for roughly 10% of my maximum health. If you can't see why this is a completely trash ability, then let me show you examples of similar abilities on every other tank. So, Brewmaster Monks have Celestial Brew, which is an even stronger absorb, for free, on a 48-second cooldown, which is realistically closer to 25 seconds when you factor in Brewmaster's inherent CDR, and this absorb can be buffed to absurd levels when you properly manage Purifying Brew during a difficult boss fight. Death Knights are kings of this niche, but I'll focus on two of their abilities: Anti-Magic Shell and Death Strike. AMS has a minute-long cooldown, but it completely absorbs a hefty amount of magic damage, and it even gives you resources for utilizing it properly. Some people may think that it's a bit cheap for me to include Death Strike on here, but it is an extremely potent heal that fills the same general niche as Ignore Pain. Sure, it's also a core component of Blood DK's playstyle, but that's also partially why the tank is so powerful in most survivability settings. For the next three tanks, please note that this was recorded on undergeared alts, so the exact numbers are going to be a bit lower than normal. Vengeance Demon Hunters have lesser soul fragments, which they generate frequently throughout their rotation. While each fragment is effectively a weaker version of Death Strike, altogether they result in a massive amount of self-healing across a fight. Guardian Druids have Frenzied Regeneration, which is arguably the strongest tank self-heal outside of Lay on Hands or Death Strike. Although it does have a cost, it's extremely small compared to the 40 rage required by Ignore Pain, and it even has a bonus healing received effect on it. Finally, Protection Paladins have Word of Glory, which on paper seems about as mediocre as Ignore Pain. However, Word of Glory scales incredibly well when used at low health thresholds, and the Shining Light passive makes it very easy to get free casts of it throughout a boss fight. As mentioned previously, survivability is supposed to be a weakness of Protection Paladins when you consider their damage output, and for some reason they still do this better than Prot Warrior in many cases. At this point, I think we've firmly established that Ignore Pain is an awful ability that provides a terrible absorb for an exorbitant cost. This ability is supposed to be Warrior's solution to their greatest weakness, and seeing how it fails miserably at this job, I think it's safe to say that Ignore Pain is almost single-handedly harming Protection Warrior's viability. Now, there are a variety of solutions for this problem, but I think that some are far more heavy-handed than others. Before people suggest it, I don't believe that returning it to its old variant of absorbing 90% of damage you take would have any noticeable impact. In terms of real changes, I think you could start by simply buffing the modifier on Ignore Pain to the point where it provides an extremely potent absorb that ends up being worth the cost of 40 rage. This is an easy change, but I don't actually think it's a good one, because it would still make Ignore Pain a niche ability that only really gets used for magic-heavy fights. To make Ignore Pain a significant part of Prot Warrior's kit, you need to change the way in which it interacts with the rage economy. This absolutely needs to involve Ignore Pain coming down in cost from 40 rage to 20 rage. For comparison, Shield Block, a far stronger mitigation spell, which also gives you a damage bonus, only costs 30 rage. Revenge, which functions as a spammable damage spender, only costs 20 rage and has a chance to be cast for free. It's worth noting that no such proc exists for Ignore Pain, despite Prot Pally having something similar for Word of Glory. Finally, Execute sits at a variable cost of 20 to 40 rage and can output massive damage while it's usable. Ignore Pain actually used to have an identical scaling cost, and while a change like that could work, the existing absorb value would need to be at 20 rage. Another crucial change that I believe should happen regardless is to make Ignore Pain count towards Shield Slam resets. As it stands, your primary way of generating rage as a warrior is to press Shield Slam and then cast other abilities in order to fish for Shield Slam procs. Spamming Revenge is a great way to do this, and it tends to create a positive feedback loop within the class. The more Revenges you cast, the more procs you get, resulting in more rage to spend on more Revenges. However, when you spend 40 rage on Ignore Pain, that rage gets lost to the void. Since it has no chance to proc Shield Slam, using Ignore Pain is actively detrimental to your rage generation, and this needs to change. While the changes I've suggested thus far are all fairly easy to implement, I actually believe that Ignore Pain could use a fundamental rework to bring it more in line with the other tank abilities mentioned earlier. The most logical way this could be done, in my opinion at least, would be to remove any sort of rage cost from it and make it a slightly longer cooldown ability, say 20 seconds. This would make it more similar to what Brewmaster, Blood Decay, and Vengeance Demon Hunter have, so I think it would make a lot of sense to have Ignore Pain function similarly. However, if they do choose to go down this route, I think Ignore Pain should have some additional functionality to make it more interesting. Something similar to Celestial Brew would be neat, such as a scaling bonus to the potency of Ignore Pain based around how many times you used Shield Slam. Now, there's many different ways to implement something like that, but I think it would be a fun way to buff the ability rather than giving it a flat modifier increase. The final change that I can think of would be to add some bonus effect to Ignore Pain, similar to the 20% healing received increase provided by Frenzied Regeneration. Something as simple as, while Ignore Pain is active, all damage you take is reduced by 10%, would go a long way towards making the ability more powerful and much more versatile. Now, I've spent a good while discussing the problems with Ignore Pain, and I do genuinely believe that fixing this ability is the key to making Protection Warrior a balanced tank. Even if you implemented all of the strongest changes that I suggested to this ability, I don't really think it would push Prot into a place where it's overly strong, but rather into a more balanced place where all of its glaring weaknesses are mostly covered. I figured this would also be a good place to talk about the data mine tier set bonuses, because I know that some people are going to argue that it'll solve the problem I've discussed here. If you haven't heard, this is what Protection Warriors are getting for their 2-piece. Consuming 30 Rage grants a stack of Outburst. Upon reaching 8 stacks of Outburst, your next Shield Slam or Thunderclap is 200% more effective, or your next Ignore Pain is 50% more effective. And for 4-piece, they get this. Avatar increases your damage dealt by an additional 10%, and it decreases your damage taken by 10%. Avatar also instantly grants you 8 stacks of Outburst. For starters, the 4-piece changes to Avatar are great. It won't make the spell into a defensive cooldown, but rather it'll make Avatar give you a nice buff to your passive Mitigation. As for the overall mechanic of stacking Outburst, I think it's good, but only when it's used for damage. Buffing and Ignore Pain by 50% is laughably low, and in my opinion, it should just be removed from the bonus entirely. Ignore Pain does not need minor supplementary buffs from things like tier sets, it needs a fundamental rework. Until Blizzard realizes this, Prot Warrior will remain in an awkward position. Now, that's all I have for this video, but if you love discussing tanks like I do, then I highly recommend you stop by my channel tomorrow. I'm about to roll out a series of videos going over core tank mechanics such as survivability, threat, and utility. Tomorrow, I'm going to be taking a look at the various forms of tank survivability, clearing up common misconceptions, and determining which method is the best at mitigating damage. If that sounds interesting, then I recommend subscribing so you don't miss it, and if you enjoyed this discussion on Protection Warriors, then I would encourage you to throw this video a like. I'll catch you later, folks.